Hi, I'm Claude,
And I'm Hudson, and you're listening to FamTalks.
where we talk about faith through apologetics and share it with you as our ministry. We hope to encourage families to talk about big questions on faith to counter the worldview from a word view.
Yes, that's right. And one such question that we have for today is, what does it mean to love God? If you find this question interesting, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so that you would be notified for whenever we upload next.
Hmm. Well, it sounds like a simple question, but I think it's so heavy to unpack.
hmm I think there's a lot, Mom, that there's a lot of layers to this question because there is love, there is God, who really is
Hmm.
God. And
Hmm.
since, Mom, we're on the topic of God and love, I think the best place to seek answers would be from the Bible itself. So here we have a verse from Mark chapter 12, verses 29 to 31. And the context of this is that Jesus was teaching, and there was a teacher of the law. And this teacher of the
Hmm.
law, he asked Jesus, Jesus, what's the most important commandment? And so
Hmm.
Jesus answers here, and that's where we will be reading from. Right? It says here, Jesus answered, the most important is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The
Hmm.
second is this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these.
You know, my son, the amazing thing about Jesus is that he's so wise on how he could just simplify things for us. You know, in
Mm-hmm,
the Old Testament, like there are 10 commandments. Sometimes it's really hard to remember those, right? But here, Jesus summarized the 10 commandments into two commandments, and that is to love God and to love others. But he provided how we can actually love God from this verse. In a way, like if we are to love God, we are to love Him with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our mind, and with all our strength. So
mm-hmm.
I think would be wise, my son, to share our thoughts maybe on each one. Like, how do we love the Lord our God with all our heart? Maybe we can start with that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, Mom, we could take from what we already discussed before in the previous episode, wherein we asked the question, is it true that you should follow your heart? And in
Hmm.
that episode, we discussed that the heart is deceitful, that it doesn't really know what's best for us. So, how are we supposed to love God despite that, despite knowing that the heart is deceitful, which is also from the Bible? And I
Yeah.
think, Mom, it all boils down to being able to lead your heart, right? Yes, the heart may be deceiving, but that doesn't mean that you have to follow it, right? I would say that when you love the Lord your God with all your heart, it's about putting your passions where God is, right? So if you're passionate about drawing, painting, perhaps you're passionate about art, then create art pieces that would be praising to God, that would worship God, exemplify the holiness of God. There are many things that you can do with your passions. There are many ways that you could lead your own heart, lead your own passions. And I think that by loving the Lord your God with all your heart, it means that all your passions should be led to go to God. That you are the one that would be in charge of your heart to lead it to God.
Right. I think that's a very good point because in terms of our heart, you're correct. Like that could be something that drives us. It's our
Mm-hmm,
passion, you know, the desires, what do we want? And those desires should be aligned with who God is.
mm-hmm,
And I think it goes against the human nature because like what we discussed in follow your heart. Clearly our heart because of sin is not designed to align with the Lord. So
mm-hmm,
that takes a big step for each one of us to really love God with all our heart, because that means our heart should be aligned to his heart.
Mhm.
And if our heart is aligned to the heart of God, that means our passions would be directed or aligned to what would please him in that
Mhm.
sense. And that
Yes.
can be quite challenging for us to really know if we don't have that relationship with the Lord.
Mhm.
We should be connected to him so that we get to know what his heart is in terms of maybe the things that we are passionate about. And
Yeah.
you're correct, my son. When you're passionate about something, you just can't think about anything but that thing.
Mhm.
And you just want to keep doing it. Like what you said in terms of art, if you're very, very passionate about art and you want to draw, all of the themes that you will be drawing would be about a certain thing, right?
Mhm.
Or you can actually spend your whole day doing it
Mhm.
and you don't even mind the time,
Yeah.
right?
So with
Okay.
that, with passions, right, you wouldn't be able to notice the time passing because you're really hyper focused on this one thing that you enjoy doing it with all your heart, right? And I think the same would apply to God. That when you loved God with all your heart, you wouldn't even notice the time passing. You wouldn't even notice how much that you have done in order or to show that you have loved God, right? And again, I think that loving God with all your heart, right, boils down to the passions that you have. That, as you said, aligning your heart with God's heart would also align your passions. And I
Right.
think with the heart out of the way, we can move on to the second item on the list that we should love the Lord your God with all your soul. So, what do you think about that, Mom?
Right. I think before we move to that, something that I'd like to highlight
Mm-hmm.
with the heart that will be connected to the soul is that our heart serves as the bloodline, right? The life
Mm-hmm.
in us, right? So it's where our blood would flow through our veins to make sure that we are still alive. And I remember my high school and college experiment wherein we have to dissect a frog, my son. Can you
Mm-hmm.
imagine, right? Um, you've opened up the frog, everything is open, and yet the heart is still pumping. And the
Mm-hmm.
frog is still alive after everything that you're doing. I feel for the frog, but you could see like how the
Mm-hmm.
heart is really pumping the blood to make sure that life will still continue in that creature. So same with us in terms of our heart, like it's the bloodline. So having your heart aligned to God serves as the bloodline for life,
Mm-hmm.
which is connected to the soul. And in terms of our soul, that would mean like everything in us, in terms of the physical things that we do. So as much as like the heart is something that is not seen, the soul is the spirit in us that would continue to live. That's our fate. That would continue to live even after this life, you
Mm-hmm.
know. So um that's why soul is very, very important because it means that this is the surrendered life that we have. So after acknowledging the Lord or yearning for God, now this is the step wherein we fully surrendered our life to the Lord. Because as it is our heart, it it's like step one, you acknowledge who God is. That I want to align my heart to God's heart. But that doesn't end there. You now have to
Mm-hmm.
fully surrender your life to the Lord, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree, Mom. And when you definitely, or when one surrenders their life to God, I think there is a change in that person, right?
Mm,
Something will change. And the
right.
most noticeable change in a person is their character, right? So
Mm,
when I've read this, when it says surrender with all your soul, and while I was listening to you, Mom, I think that we would be able to show that, or be able to show that or to be able to love God with all our soul would be having our character align with the character of God. Right? So a while ago, having our hearts align with God would align our passions. And now I
Mm,
think having our soul be surrendered with to God would align our character. We would not be exactly like Christ, but I think we'll become more like Christ. That we would have more attributes. We would be perhaps more patient, more loving, perhaps.
mm,
Maybe we'd be more kind. There is going to be a change in character. And character is tested when you're in high stress situations, when there's nobody looking. And that's when you know that you have changed. That's when you know
mm,
that there is something different and that you are loving God with all your soul. Because
mm,
when you are faced in high pressure situations or when you are faced with being alone, how do you respond? How do you act? Does it still show that you are loving God? And I think
mm.
that's one way to be able to check if you're loving God with all your soul. So
I
moving
love,
on,
yeah, I love
yeah.
that reflection, my son. Like character in terms of integrity, like when no
Hmm.
one is
Yeah,
looking. And
definitely.
how do you exactly respond? Because the real test happens during the time when no one is looking. And he also highlighted another one, high stress situation. And I think it's very important. They say that out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks.
Mhm.
Right. So our character would actually show in terms of what's inside of us,
Mhm.
you know.
Yeah, yeah.
It's interesting, like the soul and the heart would somehow like there would be certain overlapping ideas about this one because
Mhm.
it's all connected. It's your whole being. But it's good that you were able to see like aligning our hearts to God in terms of our passion and then now our character in terms of who God is becoming more Christ-like, and I think that's one of the goal. So when God tests you, it's always about moving you to being more Christ like, nothing
Mhm.
else. Because God is more concerned about your character development rather than your comfort. And He would
Yeah. Yeah.
continue to develop you towards that, right?
Yes, I agree that God is surely molding us, making us develop. And as He would develop our hearts, our souls, I think the next one on our list, Mom, is the mind. And what I
Mm,
like is that God Himself is telling us that we need to love Him with our mind as well. That
mm,
how we love God isn't only an emotion, isn't only a passion. It's not only something that is seen in our character, but it's also something that we think about. And
mm,
I think that when we love God with all our mind, we're able to properly prove to God, prove to ourselves, prove to other people that it makes logical sense to believe in God. That it makes
mm,
logical sense to love God. That we're not making excuses. This isn't you're not doing this to gain something in return. You are doing this because it makes logical sense,
mm,
right? That our minds align with God, right?
mm, mm,
Our hearts align with God, our souls align with God, our minds should align with God. And
right.
by that, I think it would just for me, it's just by being able to prove to yourself and to the people around you that God does exist, that
Mm.
loving Him does make logical sense.
That is so true, my son. Like, you just don't believe God, that He exists by faith, but you
Mhm.
actually believe because it makes logical sense. Like loving God with all our mind means God is telling us, think about it, think about your faith. Don't just believe it. You can study, scrutinize whatever is presented to you, criticize it. God is willing. God is
Mhm.
open for that because He knows that if you will be seeking the truth, you will find Him
Yeah.
and you will see for yourself that He really exists and that He is true,
Mhm.
right? So, loving God with all your mind also shows us because we are created in God's image, right? And God is wise beyond our understanding, my son.
Mm-hmm.
That's why him creating us in his image means that we can actually think. Because
Mm-hmm.
God being a God of love, he did not created us just to follow him. The mere fact that on the day of the creation, he created the Garden of Eden, right? And he only had one thing that Adam and Eve cannot eat. Can you imagine? They can enjoy everything in the Garden of Eden, and
Mm-hmm.
they only gave them one choice of not, in a way, like not one choice, but one forbidden tree
Mm-hmm.
not to eat.
Yeah, yeah.
So, God being a God of love, He's actually allowing us to think things through about His laws, the things
Mm-hmm.
that He is presenting to us. So, from the beginning of time, God wants us to think things for us. He also wants us to make a decision. He's not
Mm-hmm.
imposing to us that I am God, therefore you follow me. He's a God of love in the first place. And He wants us to follow Him with all our heart, with all our soul, and even with all our mind on our own decision, not
Mm-hmm.
because He is telling us, but because He wants us to think through it, right? Does that make sense, my son?
Yes, definitely. And I think what I could pick out from what you said is that if there is a choice, right?
Mm.
That we make that choice to choose God. And last but not least, mom, it is to love God with all your strength. And I think this one is the easiest to visualize, right? Because
Yeah.
when we say strength, as you
Mm.
said, it's something physical, it's something that you could see easily.
Mm-hmm.
And through that, right, I think it's easy to say that we can love God with all our strength through obedience. As we read through the Bible, we see that there are many laws, there are many
Mm.
things that we need to follow. But as you said, Mom, all of the Ten Commandments, which were split into many different commandments down the Old Testament, could be summarized in these two. That is through love.
Mm.
That by loving God with all our strength, it shows our obedience by being kind to other people, by putting other people first, caring for other people. That if we show our love to other people, we would be able to love God as well with all our strength, doing whatever we can physically to serve God, to obey God.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you highlighted, my son, obedience, because I think it takes all of those would need to work together. The
Mhm,
heart, the soul, and the mind to completely obey in terms of loving God with all our strength.
mhm,
And it can be challenging to actually obey in on certain cases that don't feel like obeying. There would
mhm.
always be those days.
Yeah.
So it's going against our nature. That's why the strength is very important. You know,
Mhm,
loving God with all your strength, meaning you go against your human fleshly desires, human nature to do your own thing, but to
mhm,
actually choose to do it for God. So when you talk about the heart, right, in terms of our passion, what you enjoy doing, it means that you give everything that you got. That will be your strength. It may be your physical strength, it can be your mental strength, emotional strength,
mhm,
everything that you got. So strength in this sense, like it's it's a culmination of everything. I would say, like in terms of going against our human fleshly desire to make sure that we will be able to obey God
mhm,
and to really show Him that we love Him. You know, n- there won't be a thing, or even if actually we do a lot of things for the Lord, it will not fully glorify Him if our heart is not right with Him.
mhm.
We could be exerting all our strength, human effort, but without really completely surrendering our lives to Him, right? So it's interesting that the command when Jesus said to love God with all your heart, to love God is already a command.
Mm-hmm.
And to love God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. That is how we are to love God. That
Yes,
with all
definitely.
those four things, right? Four key areas of ourselves, we will be
Mhm.
able to acknowledge and exhibit the love that we have for God.
Mm. And
Yeah.
I think, Mom, that's a great way to wrap up our conversation, right? The four aspects of our lives: our heart, our soul, our mind, and our strength. That to love God with all our heart, we are to lead our hearts. To love God with all our souls, we are to surrender it to God. To love God with all our mind, it is to make that choice, make that decision to follow God. And at the end of it all, to love God with all your strength is to gather all these things and show it through obedience. And I
Amen.
think that's the best way to wrap up the conversation, because next week we're going to be focusing on the next question, or on the next part of the verse: loving others as you love yourself. So, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to share this with a friend. Perhaps they could also learn how to love God with all their hearts, soul, mind, and strength as well.
So with that, bye for now. I might make a sore throat. So bye
Thank
for
you.
now.
Thank you for listening.